my comment by congratulating the Minister, the Honourable Rodney Hyde, who announced to New Zealand today that he has impending nuptials and an impending addition to his family. And I want to warmly express best wishes to the Minister and all happiness for his family. What is this bill, sir? What is this bill? It is the bedraggled and washed-up remains of Rodney Hyde's nutty Business Roundtable inspired agenda to remake local government. He set off around the country last year, Sue, with his Tandem paper, the Tandem paper, otherwise known as Transparency, Accountability and Fiscal Management paper. And that contained, sir, a number of elements that alarmed New Zealanders. It contained his proposal for a list of core services that councils would be required to limit their activities to. It contained his rate capping agenda. It contained proposals for mandatory referenda. If councils wanted to stray from his arbitrary and prescribed list of core services, they would have to put that proposal to a referendum, or if they were going to indeed to deviate from previously established limits on rates. And it contained also an agenda for the deregulation of municipal water that the Minister followed up by recommending to Cabinet the total liberalisation of the ownership of municipal water, sir. That would have led to a sweeping away of every single control that exists currently in legislation for the public ownership of municipal water. It is a recipe, sir, for small government and an extreme right-wing prescription that really only lives in the imaginations of the members of the ACT Party. Well, I'm pleased to say, sir, that this bill today, the Local Government Act 2002 Amendment Bill, bears little resemblance to the mad agenda that Rodney Hyde trotted around the country last year. And there's one word explains the difference between these two things, and that is Auckland. Auckland became, for Rodney Hyde and for this government, a political disaster zone. His stewardship of the Auckland Supercity reforms seriously dented the government's political standing with voters in 1/3 of the population. And his principles, his policies to corporatise local government, to open up assets for privatisation, alarmed Aucklanders so much that a solid 50% of them registered serious concern about his Auckland policies, sir, for the last year, and contributed, I believe, to the election of a mayor and a council who utterly rejected Rodney Hyde's policy prescription for local government. There was a massive public backlash against his policies, the over-centralisation of power, the corporatisation of 3/4 of local government in Auckland, and the total lack of consultation and democratic process with which he proceeded to implement the Auckland Supercity. So what remains? What remains in this bill of Rodney Hyde's agenda? Well, there are the provisions for water privatisation. Provisions that will allow a council to contract with the private sector to deliver water supply services for periods of up to 35 years. 35 years, that's 11 electoral cycles, one, perhaps 2 generations long contracts, sir. And in this bill, the ability for private sector contractors to own water infrastructure for the duration of those contracts. What's worse, and what alarms New Zealanders even more, is that a council under this bill will be able to contract out water services for 35 years, and they can do it in the dead of night without consulting anybody, without saying a damn thing to the ratepayers who have paid for those assets and whose parents have paid for them with their rates over generations. So we'll be talking more about those provisions, sir, that allow private ownership of treatment plants, of dams, of pipelines, private ownership of water infrastructure during these 35-year contracts. What else is in here? A raft of cuts to the current statutory requirements for councils to consult their citizens. Two examples: if a council wants to contract out public services to the private sector, it can do it without even saying a thing to their ratepayers and citizens. If a council wants to transfer services to a council-controlled organisation, a council-owned company, it can do that under this bill without saying a thing to their citizens, without consulting the public. The bill contains the provision for core services, albeit in a watered-down form, a narrow, arbitrary list of core services that it says councils must pay particular regard to. And we believe, sir, and many submitters to the Select Committee believe that this will tilt the playing field in favour of these core services and make it more difficult for councils to do many of the things that New Zealanders consider to be very important functions. There's no mention in Mr Hyde's list of core services of environmental protection, of economic development or social development, like, for instance, pensioner housing. We see in here a watered-down remnant of Mr Hyde's desire to have a rate capping mechanism to stop councils increasing their rates, and we see that in the financial strategy, which binds councils to limits that they've set to rates, to budget expenditure and to increases in rates. And we'll discuss that some more, sir, in the committee stages. There's a number of other issues, sir, that are probably the least offensive provisions in this bill that are about financial transparency, the requirement for a financial strategy, a pre-election report, a funding impact statement. And so we in general, support those provisions with some exceptions. But I do note, sir, that the preponderance of submitters to the Select Committee were lukewarm at best about these, and the overwhelming verdict of the local government sector was to say that these things would have very little consequence, if anything, and a number of the councils said that the main result of these provisions would be a whole lot of extra compliance requirements and significant extra cost to the ratepayer. And so that will be one of the significant legacies that the Minister of Ratepayers, Rodney Hyde, as he likes to call himself, will have delivered to the New Zealand ratepayers through this bill. Well, what did the Select Committee make of all this, and what did the people think? Overwhelmingly, sir, people submitted against the bill. By my count, there were 414 submissions on the bill in total. 360 of those 414 submissions were expressly against the water privatisation provisions. 360 out of 414. I think that is a damning indictment of Rodney Hyde's policies. Almost none of them were form submissions. And the member might like to go back and check the pile of submissions, and she will find that very, very few, probably only a handful of them, were form submissions. There was overwhelming public opposition to the water privatisation provisions in this bill. No one except the Local Government Forum, which is the business roundtable with their local government hat on, thought that the core services idea was sensible. Hardly anyone had a good thing to say about it. And I'm amazed that the government has seen fit to leave the core services thing in the bill, because no one had a good word to say about it, and I don't understand that. The great majority of individuals who submitted on this bill thought that the cuts to consultation were appalling, and as I said, the main verdict on the transparency provisions and financial reporting were that it was going to lead to a significant increase in cost to the ratepayer. So the most galling thing about the way the process that's being used is that this is the latest bill that Rodney Hyde has brought to this House that takes away the democratic rights of New Zealanders in local government. And what do we see? yet again he's pushing through one of these bills under urgency that weakens our democratic process.